Dear sir, I'm writing to inform you of the tragic death of my ex-husband, Mr. Michael Roche, who was killed by a crocodile on the 24th of July, 1995. I know that Michael had taken out life insurance in my name, and I would like to submit an application for whatever might be owing to me from this policy. Yours faithfully, Deborah Roche.
This is the strange story of the disappearance of South African businessman Michael Roche. In a remote part of Mozambique, two Polish tourists saw him attacked by a huge crocodile.
We walked along a small path close to the water. It was a large river and it was full. The water was right up to the bank. After walking for some time, our companion passed me his bag and asked us to wait a while as he had to attend to a call of nature. We heard a cry and saw a crocodile holding him by the legs. When the man was pulled completely into the water, a red patch appeared on the surface. That was the last we saw of Michael Roche.
It seemed an open and shut case. Another tragic crocodile attack in the wilds of Africa. But was it? What really happened on that riverbank in Mozambique? A few days after the attack, a letter from Roche's widow arrived in a Johannesburg insurance company. It was a life insurance claim for about £300,000, a huge sum for claims manager Hassan Sheikh Ibrahim.
I see all the large claims, and this was one of the claims that stood out far apart from the rest of them. That was the first claim that I had of an attack by a crocodile.
For payment to be made, there had to be no doubt that Roche was dead. Police had investigated the day after the attack. Surprisingly, none of the locals had heard about it. And despite a thorough search, they couldn't find any of Roche's remains. No body, no payout.
I notified the claimant that under no circumstances will I consider the claim unless, of course, a death certificate is produced. And there's two ways to produce it. One, present the body, and a death certificate will naturally be issued. Or two, is obtain a presumption of death order issued by the South African courts.
It was a huge gamble. If the widow's claim proved genuine, it would be a disaster for the company.
And I clearly remember the managing director saying to me, if you're going to go with this case and take it all the way to the courts, you must be prepared to lose your job for it.
Roche's widow was devastated. Determined to make the insurers pay, she hired a lawyer and took them to court. The insurers in turn hired their own lawyer, Michael Bernstein, a specialist in winning difficult insurance cases. But a croc attack was a first for him too.
This case was the most highly unusual I've ever come across. It belonged to a novel by someone like John Gresham.
Roche's widow seemed to have a very strong case.
My initial impression was this was a valid claim, and the insurance company were being unduly suspicious, merely because there was no body available. Obviously there couldn't be a body available. The person had disappeared in the jaws of a crocodile.
Bernstein might be a sharp city lawyer, but he had little experience of man-eating reptiles. Could a crocodile really make a body vanish without a trace?
Well, I'd only seen wild animals in the zoo, tamer animals in a circus. Like most city dwellers, and I suppose like most people, one gives wild animals a wide berth and stays away from them.
Bernstein was sure that the key to winning this case was understanding crocodile behavior. The expert witness he turned to was South African biologist Tony Pooley. He's devoted his life to studying crocodiles, in particular the Nile crocodile, Africa's most detested predator. Bernstein hoped Tony could establish whether the insurance company were justified in refusing to pay up. He sent him the only evidence he had, the affidavit written by the Polish tourists describing the attack. Tony had to decide whether a crocodile could have done it. To do that, he would have to analyze every last detail of the attack from the crocodile's point of view. Were attacks common in that river? Did it bear the hallmark of a typical croc attack? Shouldn't at least some of Roche's remains have been found? Over the years, Tony has learned to treat all crocodile attacks with suspicion. Crocodiles can be, and have been, used to hide evidence of horrific crimes.
Any death or major injury that someone suffers on the edge of a lake or a river or wherever there's water is automatically blamed on the crocodile. They've got such powerful digestive juices, such powerful stomach acids, that everything does. The bones, the sinews, the muscle, the head is crushed, everything is processed. So there's no evidence whatsoever.
With these acid-bath stomachs, it's not surprising that crocodiles are sometimes unwitting accomplices to murder.
Some years ago when I was working here at St. Lucia, I was called in to help search for a body of someone who had supposedly been killed by a croc.
The man vanished while fishing in a croc-infested river, so it was assumed crocs had killed him. Tony recovered his partially eaten body the next day. Now there seemed no doubt that crocodiles were to blame. Tony wasn't so sure, but took the body to the coroner for examination.
And when he examined the body carefully, he found that the man had been killed by a blow from a panga. Because he had a meat slit from the crown of his head right down into the vertebrae at the back of his neck, which no crocodile could do. But because of the presence of lots of crocs, it's assumed that it was crocodile.
Could Roche, like that fisherman, have been murdered? Perhaps by the Polish tourists. They could have hidden his body and invented the crocodile attack to cover their tracks. But why would they do that? In Johannesburg, Michael Bernstein was starting to scrutinize the Polish tourist story. How had they become involved?
I, Bogdan Krzemiński, born on 9th of September 1953 in Piotrów, Poland, resident in Łódź.
According to the affidavit, their story was straightforward enough. They were on safari in South Africa's Kruger National Park when they decided to pay a visit to neighboring Mozambique, which is only a few hours' drive from the park. In the capital, Maputo, they checked into the hotel Mozambicano, then went for dinner.
In the restaurant, as we tried to place our dinner order, we encountered problems in communicating with the waiter. At the table next to us sat a man who offered us his help. He joined our table and we established contact.
That man introduced himself as Michael Roche, a South African businessman. They asked him to join them for dinner. At the end of the evening, Roche offered to take them on a day trip into the countryside, early the next morning. It was during this sightseeing trip that they went for the fateful walk by the Inkamati River and watched in horror as their newfound friend was attacked and killed by a crocodile.
Then pulling him toward the water. We stood in one place, stupefied and unable to move. We ran back quickly into the direction from which we came. We managed
Even to an experienced lawyer, their story was convincing.
It appeared an open and shut case, a man meeting his death in the most horrific circumstances. with two independent witnesses having an unobstructed view and having no reason to pervert the truth.
Tony was intrigued by one key phrase in the affidavit.
A moment later, we heard a cry and saw a crocodile holding him by the legs, then pulling him toward the water.
The evidence was clear. The crocodile had attacked Roche on the bank. This just didn't seem right. In his lifelong quest to understand crocodile behavior, Tony's often analyzed attacks captured on film.
To watch wildlife footage of attacks on crocodiles teaches you more than you actually learn from years of observation, because it's so rare. You might see one attack in a year, but on a film you can rerun it again and again and again and see precisely what happens at the very last minute.
The crocodile's strategy is exactly the same, whether the victim is a person or a wild animal. The way they hunt hasn't changed in over 100 million years, since they evolved to ambush small dinosaurs at the water's edge. But for their killing technique to work, they have to be in water.
So you have a beautiful torpedo shape. They're hydrodynamically designed so that the water flows smoothly over their backs. Now the animal in the water is out of its element and cannot stay underwater for long. So that's the strategy. Grab it, pull it under, force all the air out of its lungs, and then it's soon dead. What surprised me about Roche's death was the eyewitness account of the fact that the crocodile was not in the water. It had actually run out onto land to grab him. And that is not the way that happens, because 95% of all attacks take place in the water. Hello, Mr. Bernstein.
Tony phoned Bernstein to tell him about his initial suspicions.
I've received your information.
Bernstein was skeptical, still inclined to believe the account of the Polish eyewitnesses. But he would soon be forced to reconsider. Crucial new information about Roche had come to light in the insurance company offices.
What we found at the time was that Roche was in serious financial trouble. He was creating debt for himself, was loaning lots of money, but couldn't afford to pay the bills. There was significant judgments against him, credit judgments. If you have a judgment against you for non-payment of debt, where do you find the money to pay your life insurance premiums?
Roche's life had fallen apart. Things were so bad that his car had just been repossessed.
The fact that Roche was very heavily in debt and was being hounded by his creditors meant he needed money.
Roche was broke when he disappeared. But that didn't mean that he couldn't have been killed by a crocodile. Nevertheless, for the first time, Bernstein too was becoming suspicious. But he was no closer to working out what had actually happened beside the river in Mozambique. Tony knew that the way Roche was taken, on land, was highly unusual. But the judge might not agree. After all, crocodiles do spend much of the day on land. It's because they depend on sunlight. Being cold-blooded, they bask in the sun to warm up. They can't move fast or digest food if they cool below 18 degrees centigrade. The opposing lawyers might reasonably argue that Roche had walked into the open jaws of a massive 4-meter crocodile sunbathing on the bank. Years in the field had taught Tony that this just doesn't happen.
Well, if I walk down the edge of the shore to approach those crocs there, as I get closer and closer, they'll slip into the water, submerge, disappear. Each one has a different tolerance level. The bigger ones will stay longer, but they'll all disappear to conceal themselves. And that's where they're in the element, in the water.
But once in the water, a crocodile is transformed. Sleek and fast-moving. Now it will attack.
They rely on that final burst of speed, the surprise, to grab the prey. Because they can't run very fast on land. They rely on that incredibly powerful tail to give them impetus, to accelerate them out of the water like a rocket and grab. Smash and grab is what it is.
If crocs are capable of lunging this far out of the water, why shouldn't one have run a couple of meters further and grabbed Roche?
They're not going to waste energy running up the bank because they're not designed to do that. They're very cumbersome on land. And if they kept on doing that, they would become exhausted. So they will often wait for minutes and minutes and minutes until they're literally almost a hair away from the animal's snout. And then, with that final burst, lightning quick burst, they'll grab it.
Based on every attack Tony had ever studied, Roche's death didn't make sense. Michael Bernstein was searching for clues in the statement made by the Polish tourists. He was particularly curious about why they had chosen to go to Mozambique.
Mozambique was not a tourist attraction. For the two tourists to go there to see the country seemed peculiar, and to venture into the countryside could be dangerous. The war was not all that long past. The country was recovering from the ravages of war.
20 years of civil war had left the country in ruins, its people starving. It was an incredibly dangerous place to travel.
For instance, you might expect there could be mines if you ventured off the roads. There could be attacks by bandits. It just did not seem logical that they should want to go to Mozambique.
But a country in chaos could be the perfect place for a crime to go undetected. Tony had his own reasons to be suspicious about crocodile attacks in Mozambique. Over many years, Tony has counted crocs from the air, a key part of conservation work. He's documented an alarming drop in numbers in many parts of southern Africa. In some areas, crocodiles have become an endangered species. In the early 1970s, Tony surveyed crocodiles in Mozambique. Even then, he found they were rare. But the war would make their plight much worse.
But after the wars in Mozambique, where firearms were freely available, and the whole economy had collapsed, everyone had firearms, and they were living off the land, living off wildlife. And there's a lot of meat on crocs, there's a lot of valuable parts, that skins they would sell, that's money. And that's why there's hardly a living animal or a bird left in that area. Villagers who live on that riverbank and had done for all their lives hadn't reported crocodiles in years. And if anyone would be wary of crocs, they would have been. And yet, they knew nothing about any such crop or occurrence.
A strange detail in the Polish couple's story had caught Bernstein's eye.
When they arrived in the vicinity of the village, the three of them alighted and the driver was dismissed and sent back. That was a most peculiar and suspicious circumstance. You now had the three persons, there was no food or shelter, no transport, with no way of getting back. It just did not make sense. If the driver had remained there, there would be another witness to the occurrence. Sending him back, removed from the scene, a person who could have given valuable evidence. It made me think that they would never have the scene.
Tony was very suspicious about the absence of Roche's body. A letter from Interpol revealed that local police had been unable to find any remains at all, despite intensive searching. A crocodile's powerful stomach acids could, in theory, dissolve a body. So could this explain the lack of Roche's remains? An important clue lay in Tony's work in crocodile farms. Tony was a pioneer of crocodile farming, where crocodiles are bred to supply the demand for crocodile leather without endangering wild crocs. It's now a multi-million-pound global industry. A large crocodile can weigh over a ton. But when Tony set up the first farms, no one knew how much meat crocs needed. So he had to work it out himself. And that knowledge could now be used as evidence in court.
Well, he's an exceptionally big male. He's like 4.8 meters. So he would eat probably 25, 30 pounds of the average meal. Maybe more if he's been hungry for a couple of weeks. Roche weighed 160 pounds. And the average big croc will eat 30 to 35 pounds, say in a week. And I would then say it's impossible for Roche to be eaten by one croc.
If one croc couldn't eat him in one sitting, could his remains have been hidden? Some people claim crocs use underwater larders to store extra food.
Well, larders are a myth in rivers. You don't get sort of caverns and underground ledges. And in any case, if a croc went and ate its prey there, there's so many other predators, including other big crocs, that would come and steal its prey.
There was one other possibility Tony had to consider. Had a whole gang of crocs helped to devour Roche's body? From his surveys, Tony knew crocs were very rare in the Inkamati River. Locals had confirmed this to the police. But a crocodile can smell a kill from several kilometers away. Perhaps, under cover of darkness, crocs had swum in from far and wide to join the feast. After all, this is when they are most active.
At night, they move considerable distances because now they're hunting. And they move up and down the lakes, the river systems. They travel many miles in search of their prey, be they fish or mammals.
Half a dozen hungry crocs would have made light work of Roche's body. Crocodiles can't chew, so they help each other tear food up. One croc anchors the carcass, whilst others take turns to spin off bite-sized morsels. Roche's body would have vanished in no time. The crocs would have dispersed before dawn, before locals or the police search party spotted them. Tony was pretty sure that this was impossible, that there weren't enough crocs in the river. But he needed stronger evidence. Back in Joburg, Bernstein had called in a special investigator.
As our suspicions grew, so did the conviction that we needed more evidence. For that reason, we sent the investigator to Mozambique to check up on the movements of the Polish tourists.
That investigator was Peter Leroux, an expert in death claims.
I'm the guy who investigates the suspect cases. I worked through the documents, and my immediate reaction was, I don't believe this guy's dead.
Intrigued by the case, Leroux phoned some of his contacts to see if anyone had heard of the missing businessman. What he learned about Roche was alarming.
I was warned by friends of mine that Roche was a dubious character, and I should watch out. And I should be very careful when investigating the case. Just remember one thing, I'm taking money away from them. For that reason, you've always got to be careful.
Tony's investigation was focusing on another important clue. timing of the attack. Roche had apparently been killed on July the 24th, the middle of the South African winter. Tony knew just how improbable this was, thanks to secret research he'd done for the South African Army in the 1980s. He was confident that this evidence would stand up in court, that this was the key to proving the Crocodile's innocence. Civil war was raging in another nearby country, Angola. South Africa's troops had become involved. Casualties were heavy because their opponents were being armed by foreign countries. The South African government needed to know where the weapons were coming from. Special forces were being sent in to find out. Divers were going into ports where foreign ships were known to be delivering arms. Their mission was to attach tracking devices to the ships so the government could prove who was supplying the arms. To avoid detection, divers were being dropped off several kilometers away and swimming down rivers to reach the ports. These divers were being decimated by crocodiles, so the army hired Tony to investigate.
I didn't hold out a great deal of hope of finding any solution to the problem. You can't see the hidden attacker. You can't see the crocodile in the pitch black. They had to go on dark nights. And how they found men who had the bravery and the sheer guts to do that sort of exercise, I really don't know. I started compiling a graph of when crocodiles attacked. It soon became quite apparent that as you got towards winter, they'd just tapered off until I suddenly had this graph in front of me of midwinter with virtually no attacks. It's because they're cold-blooded animals, and in winter they can't generate their own body heat, so they just fast and live off their fat reserves, which they built up over the summer months. And they can go for many, many months without any food in the cold periods. And that is the reason why you don't get attacks on humans over that cold period. They're not feeding. It's as simple as that.
Tony informed the military that the only way to protect their divers was to confine missions to winter months. And thanks to this simple plan, the lives of many men were saved. That same information would now form the core of Tony's evidence.
I had a pretty confident feeling that when the judge looked at this graph and saw what I was talking about, the fact that they don't feed in winter, whereas the attack took place in the middle of winter, he would then agree that perhaps this didn't happen. Even though there were witnesses who saw it happen, it would create an element of doubt in his mind.
I thought the graph was most persuasive. Over all the 40-odd years that he recorded these attacks, no trace of attack in the month of July. It made the story of the two alleged eyewitnesses highly improbable. But it made me think that the whole thing was a prefabrication.
Bernstein now thought the Polish tourists were lying, that Roche had paid them to make up the story of the attack. The problem would be proving it in court. Perhaps more evidence would come from P.T. Leroux, the insurance investigator who had just returned from Mozambique. His mysterious contacts had revealed more about Roche's business interests.
I heard that Roche was involved in diamond smuggling, drug smuggling, maybe arms smuggling.
Leroux was sure that Roche was still alive. In fact, he was terrified that Roche might try to kill him. He headed into Johannesburg to brief Bernstein and the insurance company. saying he had new leads on the Polish tourist, that he might be carrying critical new evidence.
I've got documents and copies of the telephone records. Which proves that the Polish people were in fact not good to.
LaRue had stayed in the Mozambicano Hotel, the exact same hotel where the Polish tourists claimed to have stayed. And he had obtained a copy of their hotel bill, proving that at least that part of their story was true. But other things didn't make sense. On that bill was a tantalizing clue. Details of phone calls made from their hotel room. The hotel record showed that over 3 days, the couple had made 5 calls to the same Johannesburg number.
What's interesting is that all the phone calls were made on 3 days to the same number.
Are these accurate records?
According to the records of the hotel, yeah, they are accurate.
Bernstein needed to know whose number this was and, if possible, what time of day each call had been made. But it wasn't all good news.
This is from your inspection into the area where the alleged attack took place.
That is correct.
LaRue had discovered one piece of information that could destroy Bernstein's case. LaRue had visited a village near the attack site. No one thought there were crocodiles in the river, except one man who had a strange story to tell. He claimed that in July 1995, the month when Roche disappeared, a murdered man's body had been found floating in the river, and a group of villagers had waded in to get him. It was known a crocodile hadn't killed him, but teeth marks suggested a crocodile had later tried to eat the man's body. Tony was convinced that in this case too, a crocodile wasn't to blame.
If that corpse had marks on it, those marks could have come about from catfish, various other species of fish in the river, from crabs, even mongooses. All kinds of creatures could have been responsible for that. Did they get the facts right? I doubt the whole story.
But he knew this story could destroy his credibility.
It disproved my evidence that attacks don't happen in July. And secondly, that there are no crocodiles in the river. So, I wondered what the judge and the lawyers would make of that.
Tony's investigation was in serious trouble. Bernstein was pressing on with his side of the investigation.
When we got the information that there were phone calls made from the hotel room, we were able to track those phone calls to the number in Johannesburg where Mr. Roche's divorced second wife lived. That was very significant to us.
Why had the Polish tourists repeatedly called the ex-wife of a man they had never met before? Bernstein was convinced that the person they were phoning in Johannesburg wasn't Roche's ex-wife, but Roche himself. Roche had never been in the restaurant, nor in Mozambique, and none of them had ever been near the Inkamati River. But how to finally prove it? Bernstein wondered about the precise timings of those calls, which the hotel bill hadn't revealed. Might they hold clues to what really happened? He contacted the Maputo telephone exchange, but getting them to send any records proved difficult.
I must have phoned anything between 30 to 40 times to try to get this documentation. Well, they haven't arrived yet and they are desperately needed.
With the court case rapidly approaching, Tony was still hoping he could find new evidence to rescue his investigation.
Well, I read the affidavit many times, and the 2 very meager documents produced by the police department, that's all I had. And I wondered to myself, well, what other possible piece of evidence could I find that would help prove what my gut feeling was about this case?
Then, out of the blue, the answer came.
I was sorting through my color slide collection, looking for a photograph that the publisher wanted of a South African river. And I realized, of course, in Southern Africa, winter levels, the river's almost dry, some of them dry up totally.
But in the story told by the Polish tourist, the river was clearly full and deep enough to conceal a crocodile close to the bank. And deep enough for Roche to disappear below the surface, never to be seen again. But July was the driest time of year. If Tony could prove the river had been low, he could prove the attack was pure fantasy. Bernstein was still waiting for the timings of the phone calls.
I, of course, speak no Portuguese, and communicating was at best somewhat hazardous and uncertain. Phone records. I was becoming increasingly desperate as the case became more proximate.
Looking at a map, Tony could see that the Inkamati River, where the attack took place, rises in South Africa in Kruger National Park. Perhaps scientists in Kruger would have records of the river level from the time of the attack. He was in luck. They knew exactly what the river levels had been. As part of their research on the fish and other wildlife that live in the park's rivers, they keep a close eye on water levels. Across the park are dozens of weirs where river level and flow are automatically recorded. By going back through their data, they were able to tell Tony that 1995 had been a drought year. The Inkamati River had been reduced to a trickle. It was the breakthrough Tony needed.
There wasn't any water in that river at that time of the year when these accidents supposedly had happened. No water in the river, no crocodile. It was as simple as that.
In Johannesburg, Bernstein had also made a breakthrough. The phone records had arrived from Mozambique, and the result exceeded all expectations. The Polish tourists had made a phone call from their hotel room at 11:47 on the morning of the attack, precisely when they claimed to be out on the day trip with Roche.
This evidence of the time of the phone calls was of vital significance. It destroyed the evidence of the alleged eyewitnesses.
In July 1996, a year after the attack, Tony traveled to Joburg for the hearing. It was a fantastic chance to stand up for the much maligned crocodile, but he was apprehensive.
When I went up for the court case, it was with some degree of trepidation and nervousness, because to stand in the Supreme Court and give evidence and be cross-examined by senior counsel is no laughing matter. Is there some hidden surprise that's going to emerge, which I haven't thought about? Give me a crocodile anytime, rather than a senior counsel in the Supreme Courthouse.
Bernstein had amassed a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but he wasn't sure it would be enough to persuade the judge that the Polish tourists were lying.
All rise.
First, the opposing lawyers presented their key evidence, the eyewitness account of the Polish couple. Then it was Tony's turn to take the stand. He presented his evidence, his conviction as a crocodile biologist, that the attack had never happened. Finally, Bernstein presented his evidence, including the timings of the phone calls. To the Polish tourists, this was a bombshell.
In all my years of experience, I've never seen a witness go white as he did.
The judge read out his verdict. The Polish couple were lying. He dismissed the evidence that Michael Roche had died. It was all an ingenious life insurance fraud.
I wasn't high. As simple as that. I wasn't high.
Tony's understanding of crocodiles had been critical to the case. Roche had clearly underestimated the complexities of crocodile behavior when he hatched his plan to fake his own death.
I was over the moon, knowing for a fact that, yet again, we've prevented a claim from being paid fraudulently.
Costs were awarded against Roche's widow, but she fled the country without paying. The insurance company decided not to press charges against the Polish tourist, and they returned to Poland. But what about the criminal mastermind, Roche himself?
When I spoke to Ross's friends, when I told them the cause of death, that he was killed by a crocodile, they laughed. They said that was impossible. That's not the Ross we know. He's too clever for that. It all points to the fact that he's still alive and well.
I believe he is alive somewhere, but where, no one would know. It was the battle between human greed and dishonesty against truth, and the good side won, which does not always occur.
They were criminals, and they were blaming it on the poor old crocodile. But the crocodile had won. It was the innocent victim in this case. And that really pleased me a great deal. You've no idea how it pleased me. Crocodiles are amazing. They are the last of the living dinosaurs. We're just lucky to have them around.
This has been a presentation of the Discovery Channel and the BBC World Class Television.